It was in 1966 that a UFO had been seen in Ely, Nevada by 3 witnesses, myself, my mother, and a neighbor girl named Jane. It happened not long after my family, the Andersons, had moved from Alberton, Montana to Ely, Nevada, but it was not remembered by any of the 3 witnesses until 1974, 8 years later. In 1974, I was sitting at my mother's house on Avenue H in East Ely at the time when she told me that she had seen a UFO in 1966. That was when I too remembered the incident. She remembered the UFO because her student Jane had told her the same thing just earlier that week, or at least very recently. This was the same timing that something else unusual had happened. I was carrying my daughter, didn't know it was a daughter at the time, didn't know she was a daughter. My mom and I had both come up with her name at the same time at different places. So I don't think there's any coincidences to this, but I don't know exactly what to read into it. We had moved to 39 Connors Court, a little house on top of what's called the terrace, and was right next door to the Coulthard family in 1966. Ruth Coulthard's daughter Jane was 7 years old when she saw the UFO over our next door neighbor's house, Marilyn Pratt's house, across the street from both of our houses. At the time of the sighting, I was either 11 or 12, and my mom, the third witness, was 36. The following is testimony that I have checked multiple times to make sure the story never changed. We'll start with Jane. In speaking to her mother, Ruth, on April 6, 2017, she verified the following statement as being true. Jane was outside playing at her house on the corner of Connors Court and Elysium Drive with her young brother Mickey on the day the UFO suddenly appeared. When Jane saw what she saw, she ran into the house, found her mom, told her excitedly that something strange was over Marilyn Pratt's house. Ruth laughed and said it was probably nothing strange anyway. By the time they both went outside to investigate, nothing unusual was to be seen. But 8 years later, when Jane was in my mother's high school class as a junior, she approached my mom and said, and this is quoted from my mother, "Mrs. Anderson, what would you say if I told you I saw a UFO over Marilyn Pratt's house?" My mother, and this is part of her testimony, told Jane to please stay after class, which Jane did, and then she approached my mother, her teacher, bashfully. My mom attributed Jane's apparent bashfulness to thinking she was in trouble. Instead, my mom wanted to talk to her about the UFO. My mom said to Jane, "I saw it too." She and Jane then discussed what they had seen. Beth, my mom, testified that they both had identical images of it except for the color. Beth, my mom, saw orange and Jane saw red, but they both saw what I had seen. My testimonies to follow. The object was hovering over the top of Marilyn's house without any apparent support. It was an object that was bigger than the house itself. Jane's mom, Ruth, now does believe Jane has seen something unexplainable, but now Jane, who refuses to speak about it, has stated that she attributes it to a weather balloon. Now, as to my testimony, there had been things happening in Alberton that couldn't be explained. My search for the truth of this matter is what led me to the understanding of what I believe had happened that day in Ely. I was outside, alone on a street that normally would have been filled with other kids, but it wasn't. I remember gazing at the rooftop of our neighbor, Marilyn Pratt's house, and above it hovered soundlessly what I remember as a bronze-colored sphere. The bronze seemed tarnished to me. As I watched, it suddenly took off over the desert to the southwest side. I remember running after it as fast as I could until it disappeared. Then I forgot about it. My mom, after Jane reminded her 8 years later, remembers being inside the house, in the front room, where a big front window was, and still is, and that our dog was barking and running in and out of the house. My sister remembers being in the front room and the dog making a fuss, but nothing more. My mom then went to the window, and she reminded me that she had said this, "Oh my gosh," as she watched me running towards the huge object hanging in the air. So she was on her way to come outside and rescue me, but she went back to her chair instead. She sat down, and she forgot about it for approximately 8 years. That's when Jane remembered and reminded her as well, which also triggered my memory. When I remembered it at age 19 or 20 in 1974, that's when the aspect of physics struck me hard. Not only had it not made a sound, but when it left there was no acceleration. It was moving at the same speed consistently and immediately. What I did do from that point forward, however, was to look for another one. For years I searched and wondered what it could have been. I never saw another one. It was in 1991 that I decided for the first time to divulge what I had seen to a very young pastor at a very non-biblical charismatic church that I was attending. When I tried to tell him what I had seen, he hissed, "That's the devil," he said with his pointed fingers configured as a cross. I no longer told anyone about the incident. Then, in 1999, I decided to travel up to Alberton, Montana to try to investigate the supernatural activity both Mom and I had experienced while living there. On the way up to Alberton, I stopped to see a man I used to work with as a volunteer at Sparks Christian Fellowship's youth group. We had breakfast together in Missoula before I went on to Alberton. When he asked me what the intention was for my investigation, I really couldn't give him an answer, either logical or factual or even emotional. I didn't know what I was expecting to find. I just wanted to find something. I decided to go anyway, even though I didn't know really why. As I was heading up the road close to Alberton, I finally cried out, "Lord, why haven't I ever seen another UFO? Why can't I talk to people about it?" All of a sudden, my left hand reached down underneath the passenger car seat and pulled out a series of tapes someone from SCF had given me months and months ago, something I'd actually forgotten about. When my hand pulled out the series, I flipped it over and saw that the last tape in the deck was entitled UFOs. I pulled out the tape, popped it into my cassette tape player. As the voice began, scientific, almost droning in intellect and fact, I immediately and angrily popped it back out saying, "I'm not listening to that crap anymore." The voice of Dr. Hugh Ross was telling me that at least 95% of the sightings could be explained away. That set me off. Then I heard the Lord ask, "Why don't you listen first and then make your judgments?" I decided to take him up on that, and I listened from beginning to end. What I remember the most is that there had to be more than one viable witness, and there had to be some sort of verifiable evidence before he would even agree to begin an investigation. The investigation itself always showed these things break the natural laws of physics, cause damage, and he also found that there was always occult activity somehow involved. In our case, we had 3 witnesses, myself, my mom, and Jane. I personally saw that the laws of physics were broken. I am unaware of any damage, but I forgot everything that happened until 8 years later, at least with that incident. Also, at the time of the sighting, my household was steeped in darkness. My mom had given us a Ouija board, and there were things like seances being conducted in that house in that neighborhood. I won't go into all the horrid details, but there was a lot of occult activity in my life. The conclusion Dr. Ross reached was that these were not natural occurrences, but supernatural, and their nature was harm, so they were demonic. My mom's conclusion of what happened is this. The dog could hear something we couldn't. That's why he was so agitated. The UFO housed aliens looking for survivors of a crash, some of their own citizens, that had happened at some point. She thinks the crash was in Roswell, but wasn't sure. She states they are advanced beings that are our ancestors that can appear and disappear at will because their intelligence is greater than ours. Jane's conclusion, no discussion of the matter, stating after she was grown that it was only a weather balloon, even though it was her eyewitness statement that started my mom's remembrance and my investigation. Now, as for me, I believe what Dr. Ross has to say. These beings are not natural, they're supernatural. Since there's destruction associated with them, they are not our friends. Jesus spoke a lot about demons. They are evil. A house divided against itself will fall. Dr. Ross would not attribute these occurrences to the enemy, the devil, if he were one of their allies. I will trust him as my ally. So my advice to anyone on this earth is that if anyone from outer space comes and introduces themselves to you, make sure you ask for identification that can be verified by somebody in the field of science, someone whose work has integrity and truth behind it, verifiable scientific evidence. In other words, ask, where are you from and how did you get here? And can you please share the technology you use to break our laws of physics, showing us how to use it and taking us to your place? Now, as for me, my mother's conclusion cannot be scientifically proven, although she should have the greatest leg to stand on, since hers does conclude it's natural. Science is natural, and therefore should be able to prove all points. But she can't, and she doesn't want to try. She believes what she believes because she wants to. Simple enough. End of story.